All right, using I to rewrite square roots of negative numbers. Okay, you can't take the square root of a negative and get a real number answer. You try to do it in your calculator, it's going to give you an error message. This is where imaginary numbers come into play. The letter I actually is equal to the square root of negative 1. So, if they ask you to simplify the square root of negative 13, you're going to break that down to be the square root of 13 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 is represented by the letter I. I cannot take the square root of 13, so I have to leave it as the square root of 13, and I can't simplify it either. Now, since this answer is part real and part imaginary, normally the real part goes in front of the imaginary part, but because it's trapped under a radical, you actually have to put the I first and then the square root of 13 second. I have no idea why I'm writing on an angle. Sorry about that. Just tilt your head. It'll be okay. So my answer that I'm going to put in this box up here is I square roots of 13. However, if they had given me, let's say, the square root of negative 25, that would be the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1, and the square root of 25, that is just 5. And then the square root of negative 1 is represented by the letter I. And so this one you would simply write 5I. Okay? They can also give you one where you have to do quite a bit more simplifying. Kind of running out of room, so let me come over here and erase this one. Let's say I gave you the square root of negative 18. Okay. Well, 18 is not a perfect square. However, 18 is the same thing as a 9 times 2. So I'm actually going to break this down to be 3 different radicals. I'm going to break it down to be the square root of 9, the square root of 2, and the square root of negative 1, because those 3 numbers all multiply together is negative 18. I can take the square root of 9, that is 3. I cannot take the square root of a 2, so that just remains square root of 2. And then the square root of negative 1 is represented by the letter I. Now this one, you have a 3, which is not under the radical, and the 2 is. So the radical should always trail on the end. So you put it here, and then the I is going to go in front of it, and then in front of the I you'll have the 3. So your final answer to this mess would be 3I times the square root of 2. Now, after you get used to doing this, a few times, you don't have to write the whole tree down like I did over here. I can look at, hey, the square root of negative 25, that's going to be a 5I. Just like the square root of negative 9 would be a 3I. Or the square root of negative 49, that's going to be a 7I. So that part you can figure out mentally and just do it in your head after a while. Sometimes you have to write it down like I did right here to get it going. That's a mess. So there's an easier way to do this than just using the back of my pen. So one more where you have to simplify it. Let's say it's come on, pen, the square root of negative, how about 50, a negative 50. If I were doing this, I would be like, okay, a perfect square factor of 50 is 25. So when I do this, I usually put the negative sign with the perfect square. So I've got the square root of negative 25 times the square root of 2. And then, of course, I can take the square root of negative 25. That would be a 5i. I cannot take the square root of the 2, so I just leave it as the square root of 2. And then this would be 5i times the square root of 2. Hope this is making sense. That's simplifying a square root that has a negative number underneath of it. You're literally going from a real number to imaginary. And just remember that I, the letter I, represents the square root of a negative 1. That's the key part to remember.